Hello and welcome to Mendoza Reacts to PMQs. Let's have at it.
We now come to the Leader of the Opposition, Right Honourable Keir Starmer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yesterday, the government announced the next stage of easing lockdown restrictions. If that plan's to work, and we want it to work, we need an effective track, trace and isolate system. The Prime Minister promised a world-beating system would be in place by the 1st of June.
It wasn't.
The latest figures from yesterday's press conference hosted by the Prime Minister showed that 33,000 people are estimated to have COVID-19 in England. The latest track, trace and isolate figures show that just over 10,000 people with COVID-19 were reached and asked to provide contact details. I do recognise the hard work that's gone into this.
What hard work?
But if 2/3 of those with COVID-19 are not being reached and asked to provide contact details, there's a big problem, isn't there?
Well, yeah, there is, because we don't have a test, track and trace system.
On the contrary, Mr. Speaker, I think that the Right Honourable Gentleman has been stunned by the success of the test and trace operation, and contrary to his prognostications of gloom, it has got up and running, I think, much faster than the doubters expected.
This is just a complete lie.
And they are getting it done. Dido Harding and her team have recruited 25,000 people, and so far they have identified and contacted 87,000 people who have voluntarily agreed to self-isolate to stop the disease from spreading. Now, I don't think he would have predicted that a few weeks ago, and I think he should pay tribute now to Dido and her team for what they're doing.
Pause. That was just a complete lie. That is just a complete and utter lie. We don't have an operational track and trace system. And while we're at it with the lockdown, you might remember this image from when we first heard from Boris Johnson that he would be easing lockdown. And as you can see, each step of the lockdown ending process is attached to the R rate. And he was reassuring us at the time that unless we met those measures, that the R rate fell below 1 across the United Kingdom and so on, then each of these gates of lockdown would be released. And if we didn't hit them, they wouldn't be released. What's actually ended up happening is that they've just gone on and done all of these things anyway without even hitting any of the scientific measures that they put in place. So two things are happening parallel to each other. One is they are lying about the UK being anywhere near ready to ease lockdown to the degree that they're doing it. And that is the reason why the devolved governments in Scotland, Northern Ireland and Wales have taken an entirely different approach. Secondly, they also don't have the track and trace system in place that they would need to be able to monitor emerging clusters of virus and shut them down immediately. There is nothing remotely scientific about what is happening here. And he's standing up here asking us to clap an imaginary system. That is batshit. Play.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister just hasn't addressed the question I put to him.
Thanks.
I wasn't asking about those that have gone into the system, the 10,000, or who's been contacted. I was asking about the 2/3 of those with COVID-19, of the 33,000 who weren't reached. This is a big gap.
It's a massive
and the
gap.
Prime Minister risks making the mistakes he made at the beginning of the pandemic, brushing aside challenge, dashing forward, not estimating properly the risks. If 2/3 of those with COVID-19 are not being contacted, that is a big problem.
Yeah.
Because if we don't get track, trace and isolate properly running, we can't open the economy, we can't prevent infection disease spreading. So let me ask a question in a different way. What's the government's strategy for closing the gap between the number of people with COVID-19 and those going into the system? Not what happens to those that go into the system.
Speaker, I hesitate to accuse the right honourable gentleman of obscurantism. He's misleading on the key point. The number of people with COVID, of course, is an estimate in this country. Mr. Speaker, he's inadvertently misleading.
Prime Minister, one of us is going to have to give way. It'll have to be you. Prime Minister, obviously nobody misleads, and no honourable member ever would, whichever side they're from. Prime Minister.
He's inadvertently, I think, giving a false impression of what Test and Trace is doing. The 33,000 cases in the country is, of course, an estimate. What NHS Test and Trace is doing is contacting the vast majority of those who test positive and their own contacts and getting them to self-isolate. And it is a formidable achievement.
What, do you want a cookie?
Mr. Speaker, and yesterday the right honourable gentleman was kind enough actually to say that he supported our policy and supported our programme. I seem to remember him saying that loud and clear.
Yeah, he did.
Today, and as I say, I understand the constraints of the profession in which he used to work. I know how it works. Yesterday and today he seems to be yo-yoing back into a position of opposition. Which is it? Is he supporting what we're doing or is he against it?
This is why you don't kiss his ass, Keir.
Mr. Speaker, the figures I gave that the Prime Minister says are inadvertently misleading are the slide at his press conference yesterday and the slide at the government's press conference last week, the latest figures. They're the two figures. Mr. Speaker, I do support the next stage of the operation, but the Prime Minister is wrong to reject challenge. 65,000 people have lost their lives because of COVID-19. The Prime Minister should welcome challenge that could save lives rather than complaining about it.
Yeah.
Another risk to this plan is if local councils don't have the powers and resources to implement local lockdowns. There's a report today that 8 out of 10 councils face bankruptcy or cutting services. Many of those are in the North East and Midlands, whereas the Prime Minister knows the worst affected areas for COVID-19. And the real concern amongst council leaders is that they don't have the powers or guidance to implement lockdowns quickly if needed. The Conservative leader of Oxfordshire Council said, "I'd be interested for central government to confirm what is meant by local lockdown, including clear guidance as to those powers and what's expected of us." Can the Prime Minister tell us when local authorities will get the guidance that they need?
Mr. Speaker, everybody understands, and we've seen it already across the country, when there are local outbreaks, for instance, in Weston-super-Mare or in GP surgeries in North London, there have been local lockdowns, local crackdowns. We have a very effective cluster-busting operation, which is designed to ensure that we keep those outbreaks under control.
Pause. This is so outrageous. He doesn't have an effective cluster-busting operation at all because he doesn't have a track and trace system in place, as we've already established. There is no cluster-busting operation. This is just PR. Clearly, local councils don't know how to manage a local lockdown because they haven't been given any guidance. They haven't been given any further funding. And even Conservative leaders of councils, as Keir Starmer has just pointed out, are writing to him to say, "We don't know what to do. Please tell us because we'd really like to be able to do what you're implying that we should be doing, but you haven't given us any guidelines." Remember, this is in the middle of a public health crisis where people having up-to-date and accurate information is literally a matter of life and death. So here you would expect Boris Johnson to say, "We have given councils X amount of additional funding in order to meet these. We issued guidelines on the X date of whatever. And I would like to take the opportunity to reiterate those now. When your R rate hits 1, you will initiate a local lockdown, which means, people stay in their homes. People who can work from home stay at home. There's no travel in or out of the city. Or, we have no idea what the guidelines would be, but it would be his opportunity to lay those out. That is what leadership would look like. What you're seeing here is he's actually not saying anything. He's simply denying reality. Everyone already knows. Well, everyone clearly doesn't already know.
councils understand how to do it with the local resilience forums, backed up by the joint biosecurity centre. That is how it works, and that is how it is going to work.
So he's just said it's going to be backed up by the joint biosecurity centre, which doesn't actually yet exist. So he's saying people should already know what to do, despite the fact that no guidelines or additional funding have been provided to support with that. And if you have any other questions, let me refer you to an imaginary organisation that does not actually exist. Play.
And it is a very effective way of keeping this disease under control. I'm not going to pretend to him or to the House that this thing is beaten or that the virus has gone away, because clearly that is not the case. We have to remain extremely vigilant.
No shit, Sherlock.
And local councils will be supported in doing their vital work in implementing local lockdowns.
How?
Stan.
How?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I now turn to the app? This really matters because unless someone with COVID-19 can name and identify everybody they've been in contact with, the app is the only way of tracing unknown contacts. The Honourable Member for Hove made precisely that point yesterday. He gave the example of how on earth do you trace everyone in close contact at a seafront or in a park without an app. Up until last week, the government maintained that the app was critical, another of their slides. But at the weekend, the Health Secretary downplayed the app, saying it was only ever additional support. So which is it? Critical or not?
Mr. Speaker, I wonder whether the right honourable gentleman can name a single country in the world that has a functional contact tracing app.
Germany.
Because there isn't one. What we have, and I think what has, I'm afraid, left the opposition slightly floundering, is a very successful test and trace, NHS test and trace operation, which yesterday they supported. Yesterday they said it was good enough for this country to go forward with step 3 of our plan. Today they're yo-yoing back again and saying that it's not good enough. I think they need to make up their mind. I think they need to get behind NHS test and trace and support it and take the country forward together.
I got such a problem with his demeanour that we're talking about an app which is an important element of a solution to the worst public health crisis in 100 years, and he's treating it like it's the frickin' student union debate, smirking and playing about and dissembling. It's just like, where is the grown-up in this room? Play.
Germany. App working 15th June. 12 million downloads. 12 million downloads. Mr. Speaker, I checked that. The Health Secretary said we'd have the app by mid-May, presumably on advice. The Prime Minister said we'd have it by the 1st of June. Now the government ministers say it won't be ready until the winter. We've spent 12 million on this. Other countries are ahead of us. When are we going to have a working app?
Nobody knows.
Mr. Speaker, I'm afraid he's completely wrong, because no country in the world has a working contact tracing app, and we've always been clear that the app would be the icing.
Pause. Okay, can we just go and look at the countries in the world that actually do have a functioning app? Because this is complete lie. So you can check this and verify this yourself. Why would you lie about something which can so easily be proven false, unless you had such complete contempt for the people listening you didn't think they'd even bother to check?
On the cake. Well, if we can get it to work, it will be a fine thing, but there isn't one anywhere in the world so far. What we do have is a fantastic test and trace, NHS test and trace operation that is already up and running, that is going to get better and better and will be indispensable to our future success. And I think he should support it. And I think, by the way, that he should be making much clearer that he supports our programme going forward. And since he mentions Labour councils and support for Labour councils, perhaps he might clear up the position of yesterday and so say once and for all that Labour councils should be encouraging children in their areas now to go back to school. Isn't it? We heard some warm words from him yesterday. Can he now confirm that he wants all children who can go back to school to go back to school this month?
What has that got to do with whether his app is up and running?
Yes, the only U-turn here was the Education Secretary on the 9th of June, who ripped up the government's plan to have children back into school before the summer break. Mr. Speaker, there's a theme to these exchanges. Last week I asked the Prime Minister about 2 claims about child poverty. He said absolute child poverty and relative child poverty have both declined under this government. On Monday, the Office of the Children's Commissioner ruled that the Prime Minister's answer was mostly false. The Prime Minister also said there are 4,000 fewer families living in poverty now than there were in 2010.
It's a lie.
On Monday, the Office of the Children's Commissioner ruled that that was simply false. He's been found out. He either dodges the question or he gives dodgy answers. Mr. Speaker, no more witnesses. I rest my case. Will the Prime Minister do the decent thing and correct the record in relation to child poverty?
Is he going to do
Mr.
it?
Speaker, I'm happy to point out to my learned friend that actually there are 100,000 fewer children in absolute poverty, 500,000 children falling below thresholds of low income and material deprivation. This government, as he knows, is massively increasing universal credit, 7 billion more to help the poorest and neediest families in our country. We're getting on with it. We're taking the tough decisions, and he still can't make up his mind. Talking about child poverty, the single biggest determinant of a child's success is whether or not he or she goes to school. He still won't say whether children should go to school. I think, Mr. Speaker, it's absolutely infamous for him to come to this House one day and say he supports the programme, and then the next day not to confirm that he wants kids to go to school now.
This is word salad. Pause. Okay, firstly, we need to talk about word salad. So word salad is a form of, it's a term used in the world of narcissistic abuse, and it's a means by which someone avoids giving you an answer and creates such a confusion that you end up starting to doubt your own reality. So it's close to gaslighting, but it's a word salad. If you almost think gaslighting sort of is a strategy and word salad is a tactic. So word salad is a tactic you would use to gaslight somebody. So what Boris Johnson just did there is you basically put all these words together that individually and maybe in clusters of 2 or 3 make sense, but when you add them all together, they don't actually form a coherent argument. So as the listener, you're so busy trying to actually make sense of what's being said that you've almost forgotten the question you asked and forgotten the issue that you're discussing, and you're just trying to make this thing make sense. And it's a very effective way of putting someone on the back foot, and that is what Boris Johnson is attempting to do here, not only to Keir Starmer, but to everyone in the room and also to the rest of us who are watching, where we're just going, wait, I thought we were talking about an app, and I thought we were talking about child poverty figures, and now, wait, we're talking about children going back to school. What is that about? Then the reason someone does that is because they know that they can actually engage in the conversation with you, because you're right. You've pointed out something which is inconsistent with what they're saying. And instead of someone with an adult level of emotional intelligence and integrity would say, you're right. Yeah, this is an issue. Child poverty has gone up. Here are the things that we're going to do to actually deal with that. Because you actually want to deal with child poverty. But the problem Boris Johnson's got is that he doesn't want to actually deal. He's not going to, this government hasn't got anything to say about child poverty. So let's just take a look at what the truth is. So Boris Johnson told the House last week that there were something like 4,000 or 5,000 fewer children in poverty today than in 2010. But what is the real picture? This information comes from the Child Poverty Action Group, and the most recent data is looking at the year 2018 to 2019. So with everything that we're seeing now with coronavirus and the impacts on the economy, you can guarantee these figures will only be worse. So 72% of poor children live in working families. Their parents aren't unemployed. They're actually working, but they don't get paid enough. So Boris Johnson said there are about 4,000 fewer children living in poverty today than in 2010. What's the truth? Well, there are 600,000 more children living in relative poverty since 2010 and 100,000 more children living in absolute poverty since 2010. And one of the worst things about this is that this is while the economy has actually grown by about 16%. So it's not like there's been a recession and it's impacted people. People are now poorer despite the economy growing. And that tells you that the policies of the last 10 years have been a kind of economic apartheid, where instead of wealth being redistributed from those with the most to those with the least, it's actually happening in reverse. And we're now at the point where 51% of poor children are under 5 years old. So that means there are 2 million children in the UK under the age of 5 that are living in poverty. And another figure that should worry you is the proportion of poor children in couple families is now up to 68%. So again, the old sort of myths about the idea that children living in poverty would maybe have only one parent or their parents would be unemployed. Well, now the majority of poor kids are in a home with parents that are still in a couple and they're working. So again, this is not about just the amount of money that's in the economy, it's about how that money is being distributed. This is a political choice because in this entire 10 years, the advice of how to solve this issue has been really, really clear. First, raise the minimum wage. We have to have a living wage in this country, and that means a wage consistent with the cost of living. And broadly, that is considered £10 an hour outside of London. Secondly, stop and scrap universal credit. And this actually came through loud and clear during the coronavirus because a lot of people, some of whom might have considered Britain to have a very generous benefit system, suddenly found themselves unemployed in March, April, May and this month of June. And suddenly found that all they were entitled to when they went to the job centre was £83 a week in universal credit. That would not cover most people's rent, let alone their entire cost of living. Yet that is the circumstances that we are forcing people into. The next step is to ban 0 hours contracts. Historically, you would have a full-time employment contract which would state that you worked 37.5 hours a week for X £1,000 a year, which gave you an hourly rate that you could work out, and that was the end of it. And you came in Monday to Friday on those hours. But now most people, in fact, in the hospitality sector, in retail, are on 0 hours contracts, which means they're not even guaranteed their hours or a salary. Now, the only justification for this would be in a situation where you didn't know how many hours you were going to need a week. But when you're a multinational supermarket, you know you're going to need that person on the till Monday to Friday. So the use of a 0 hours contract is simply so that they can avoid things like holiday pay, sickness pay, meeting living wage standards and other employment rights that would mean that those people were not going to have to live in poverty. You know, the right to unionise. All of these rights are attached to secure employment. They don't apply to 0 hours contracts. And so they have just exploded. And so that's that. Those are the real figures that we're dealing with, that Boris Johnson is refusing to admit to. And last week in Parliament, Boris Johnson actually told people that the scenario was that there were 4,000 fewer children living in poverty in the United Kingdom today than when the Conservatives and the Liberal Democrats started their coalition government back in 2010. The reality was there were 600,000 more children living in relative poverty since 2010 and 100,000 extra children living in absolute poverty. This man is a liar.
Ian Blackford.
Yay! Come on, Ian, let's do this.
The Scottish Advisory Group has called for an accelerated review of the devolved fiscal framework. Crucially, it has supported a significant increase in access to capital to stimulate an investment-led recovery in Scotland. Scotland can make different choices and invest in a strong recovery, but we can only do it with the necessary financial powers. Our First Minister and our Finance Secretary have already made a request for more borrowing powers. Will the Prime Minister implement the recommendations of these business leaders and give the Scottish Parliament the economic powers it needs to fuel a recovery in the wake of the pandemic? Or will the Prime Minister put Scotland's economic recovery at risk?
Well, I respectfully remind the right honourable gentleman that the Scotland has so far received, as part of our UK campaign against coronavirus, £3.8 billion now in Barnett consequentials, a fact that I'm sure is seldom off his lips in his discussion with his SNP colleagues. We will continue to invest massively in Scotland because Scotland, like the whole of the UK, benefits from being part of the oldest and most successful political partnership anywhere in the world, and I congratulate the SNP, by the way, on their U-turn, which could be, I think, copied with advantage by our friends on the front bench opposite, on their U-turn on education and getting all kids into school.
I mean, seriously. So I think Mendoza reacts to PMQs is extra important this week because we had several cases there where Boris Johnson was just flat out lying. So I hope it's helped you to have that information corrected reliably so that you can go and have those arguments with your friends on Facebook. Thank you for tuning in as always, and until the next time, bye-bye.